Greetings. My name is Maria Monteiro. I'm a lecturer in church music at Baylor, and I serve as music director at First Mexican Baptist Church in San Antonio. I have just finished my PhD in church music, and my previous degrees are in musicology. So, for a session on church ministry in a music conference, why have I chosen to talk about visual arts? Let me explain. First of all, I am interested in a variety of subjects in addition to music: history, politics, Christian worship, soccer, theology, travel, education, and the arts, to name a few. I consider interdisciplinary interactions very appealing. Second, I grew up in close contact with art and artists of all kinds. My father has been an artist for over 60 years. My brother is an artist as well, and so is my daughter. Although I do not paint or draw myself, I feel very comfortable around the world of visual arts. Finally, and more importantly, I believe the arts can make an important contribution to our efforts to connect with the divine. To this end, we have already embraced music and poetry wholeheartedly. I'm suggesting that we consider the visual arts as an additional element in this endeavor. So, what could the visual arts offer us, individual Christians, and to our congregations and Christian communities? What can the visual arts do? What can art say that music, theater, dance, and poetry might miss? To help us consider these and other questions, I thought it would be profitable to have a conversation with an artist who is a Christian and who is also seriously engaged in the life of a Baptist congregation, my daughter, Juliana Monteiro.
Hello, I am Juliana Monteiro, and I have been an art teacher at Hondo High School for the past 5 years now. In addition to that, I have a bachelor's degree in English from Trinity University in San Antonio. I have a master's degree in education from Baylor University, and I'm also highly active in my church. I teach Sunday school, I sing, I am on a few committees, and I try to serve however I can. Um, and as an artist, I paint, I draw, and I work largely by commission.
What we plan to do is simply to share some of our ideas about art and worship, address some potential concerns related to this topic, and offer a few suggestions on how to explore the somewhat overlooked dimension of our creative spiritual lives. We have also prepared a list of resources for you to explore on your own in case you feel inspired to do so. We hope you do. So let's get started. Many years ago, while looking through an art book, my father was impressed by the beauty of the trees displayed on the pages of the book. He turned to his mentor at the time, the Argentinian Brazilian painter Caribe, and said, "These tropical landscapes are amazing. Have you ever seen such beautiful trees?" Caribe told my father to close the book. He then opened a window and, pointing toward the landscape just outside the house, said, "Is this what you were talking about?" Sure enough, the Northeast Brazilian flora looked just like the images in the book my father was admiring. He had never before made the connection between the place he was familiar with and the exotic landscapes celebrated in books.
I think the story perfectly illustrates how we can so easily overlook the value of seeing in our daily life and in our worship practice. Worship is a sensory experience, and so I think we need to train ourselves a little bit to look and see the way that artists do. In our daily lives, we deal with an overwhelming amount of visual input, so it makes sense that we develop a type of mental block that might keep us from noticing everything around us. So there are a few tricks that I think can help us become more familiar and more appreciative of our surroundings that can then further enrich our worship experience. First, I think it's important to look around and pay attention to the details. This is a photo that I took on my front porch a few weeks ago. Every time that I come home, I have this habit of looking all around the door jamb, partially to keep myself from touching a bug that I don't want to, but also because I often find little surprises that kind of make my day better. Cicadas coming out of their cocoons or shells, leaves that have blown onto the porch, flowers, and then this little creature who happened to be hanging out in our snake plant. She blends in really well with the leaves, and so it's very much one of those blink and you miss it kind of situations. And I think just this practice of taking a moment and looking around before continuing on with your day, or just trying to get into the house, can really help kind of make the world seem more interesting and open and exciting. The other thing that I've learned as an artist is how important it is to find beauty in ordinary things. For here, it's not just the teacup, which in itself is already a work of art, but it's the interaction of all of the elements on the table. It's the teacup, but it's the shadows, it's the hand, it's the ring on my finger, it's the other dishes that are kind of lurking in the background, and the way they create different shapes and add different tones of green based on the shadows they're casting. All of this was taken during a pretty loud dinner. There were a lot of people talking and a lot of interesting conversations going on. But by kind of looking down and looking at smaller things, I was able to find these pieces and these shapes that really added, I think, to the situation for me. The conversation was really great, but I think the elements were also worth spending my time on. And then finally, I think the importance of changing your perspective or reframing something. This is the bedroom window that I have whenever I visit my grandmother's house. I've seen this exact same view every year for at least 20 years now. But for some reason, looking at it through this doorway made it seem completely new. There was something about the angle of the tiles and how they contrasted to the roof and the light on the tiles closer to the balcony and the fence, and then all of these kind of hard edges in front of this kind of wild cityscape going on in front of me. So it really made me pay attention much more to what was going on immediately outside of my window every day, even though it's a view that I've seen so much. There was just something about this new shape that really added to my experience. All of these things, changing your perspective, finding beauty in ordinary things, and paying attention to details, you can train yourself to do this through a practice called slow looking. I'm sure there's other names for it, but I call it slow looking. And so, for example, this is a photo that I took on my last trip. And at first glance, you're probably going to see the obvious elements here. There's a big tree. There's a street that has some sort of construction going on. There's a couple of people walking. There's a car. There's a motorcycle. There's the sky. There's a chaotic cable situation going on. But if you stop and really look at each corner and then move your eyes slowly through the piece and really take a minute to look at everything going on, you'll start to see that the wind is blowing. There are a couple of flags in the background in a little rainbow, and they're all at different positions because the wind is blowing through them. And you can see the same thing on the left, where there's this white bar that has some sort of plasticky paper attached to it that's blowing in the wind. You'll see some like brick detailing in one house, and then in the house in the back, there's these tiles that contrast with kind of the plainness of the walls around it. You'll see little spikes along the wall of the fencing outside. You'll see the plants in the front and how different they are from kind of everything else around it. And that the people who are walking, their legs are in the same position, which I just think is an interesting detail. They have their front leg forward and their left leg is bent back. And then as you move further back, there's this tree which has like an orange spot in it, and then there's a city behind it, and then so you can kind of build on everything that you see to really flesh out kind of the experience of the day, rather than just looking at the obvious kind of chaotic mess of the street as it is.
Over the centuries, Christians have debated the appropriateness of the use of the arts in the service of the church. And depending on the context, the topic is still controversial today. While we will not discuss the issue here, we believe that it's important to at least acknowledge it. In the book titled Arts Ministry, Nurturing the Creative Life of God's People by Michael J. Bauer, that's his book. It's very good. He includes a helpful chapter addressing skepticism about arts ministry, and he lists 4 of the main concerns that have been raised against the use of the arts in the church throughout history: idolatry, stewardship, morality, and distraction. It is up to each one of us to examine these and other potential risks associated with the use of the arts in the church, just as we should examine and consider any other practice, habit, or attitude we employ or embrace as we seek to live our lives as followers of Christ. Despite these dangers, as Bauer wrote, if handled correctly, and I quote, the arts very clearly have the power to focus our attention on the divine, to forge bonds with God that are enlivening, and that lead us to new depths of spirituality and holiness.
So a lot of times when we talk about worship, I'm speaking as a layperson, not as someone who has studied this. I will just make that caveat. I think kind of the default practice is through music. It's congregational singing, it's choral singing. And there is a lot of, like, there's a huge emotional impact that goes along with singing in a group. You have this, it's almost like a euphoria that you can get. And I think, and that's wonderful, and that's a really important part of church life. But I think one thing that happens is that we can sometimes miss out on kind of the vastness of human emotion, and that there is a space for all of those things in Christian life and in worship. So what I think visual arts can do is it helps to fill in a few of those gaps, not just through emotion, but also through just comprehension. So I'm going to show a few images here and talk a little bit about what they can reveal about Christian life and about faith, and how we can use things like this in worship. So this first piece is The Conversion on the Way to Damascus by Caravaggio. If you are familiar with Caravaggio, it's not surprising that this is a very dramatic piece. He was a very dramatic man. But what I love about this piece is it captures a moment that I think we frequently overlook when talking about this specific story. at this point in the New Testament, Paul he's still Saul, and he is still very much a villain in kind of the Christian context. And then he has this great moment where he sees Jesus and is blinded by this vision, and he goes through his own conversion and then becomes one of the most important people in Christian history. I think we miss the actual moment that Paul is blinded. And this painting, I think, captures it. It is kind of, there's a bit of euphoria in it. It is a very dramatic, exciting piece, but there's a lot of darkness, because I think there's also a lot of fear in this kind of sudden loss of vision. So I think that visual arts can emphasize some of the more confusing moments of Christian life, or just life in general. It can show us the fear, even in the midst of something positive, that we can so often experience. Another example of this is this piece by Katakovitz called Pietà. Pietà, it's a very frequent image in art. It's the moment of right after the crucifixion, where Mary is holding her son. I love this version of the Pietà because it so beautifully captures the grief that the mother feels. So it's a really great empathic piece that helps us to connect to other characters in this story. We talk a lot about the crucifixion from the perspective of Jesus, and we talk about it from the perspective of kind of humanity. But having these moments can really help us understand how real those events were and how people felt at the time, and that can also influence the way that we feel about kind of these big moments in Christian history. This piece is called Let My People Go by Aaron Douglas. He was a painter during the Harlem Renaissance, and he illustrates this moment that is obviously in reference to Moses' conversation with Pharaoh. But rather than having this kind of depiction of Egypt and the Israelites, it shows instead this moment of conquest and a figure who is kneeling in supplication. It's a really interesting piece, and I think it captures the violence of those kinds of moments. It captures the tragedy of a lot of that, and it also illustrates how the artist understands God's relationship to the oppressed. It's a theme that we see frequently in the Bible, but in this context, it really helps us. It reminds us of what that actually means, and who are the oppressed, who are the conquerors, how are we supposed to view not just the moments that are listed in the Bible, but moments throughout history. Sada Watanabe was a Japanese artist, and he took that idea of recontextualization and really brought it into the importance of representation, and how when you can see yourself represented in the context of biblical stories, it makes those stories more personal and more relevant. So here we have this depiction of the Last Supper, and he's done this using Japanese block printing styles. The meal is more reflective of a Japanese dinner rather than the bread and wine. You see fish. And then the people, they're wearing patterns that are more familiar to people in Japan as well. So it's a way of making these stories personal and making them relevant, that can be easily missed without these kind of visual elements. And then finally, this piece by Agnes Martin, it's called Praise. It's from her rubber stamp portfolio. And it's a piece that's completely abstract. And what I think is really beneficial about abstract art is that it is entirely dependent on the viewer to understand it and to interact with it. There's no real information in this piece. So it's up to us to figure out what we feel and what we think it means and what it might mean for us. And there's no very, very, very often, there's not really a wrong way to interact with abstract art. You can feel how you want to feel about it, whether those feelings are positive or negative. So it serves as kind of a blank space that we can focus on, as opposed to like losing ourselves in distraction. It's also really helpful for times of meditation. I am not really good at praying with my eyes closed because I get distracted by my own brain. And so if I can look at something while praying, it actually helps me focus better. And so abstract art can be really helpful in those situations as well.
We thought it would be helpful if we shared some of the ways we have used the visual art in our own contexts. And here are 3 examples. Several years ago, as part of a grant I received from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, I had the opportunity to design a hands-on art class where college students were challenged to create visual representations of messianic texts from both the Old and New Testament they themselves had selected. The class was taught by Nancy Johnson, a professional artist from Austin. And at the end of the semester, we held a chapel service in which we displayed each art piece on a slide along with the scripture on which the work was based. The entire service was a silent meditation guided by the messages of the art and scripture. No singing, no instrumental music, no sermon, no spoken words. The students had produced a little over 30 works, and for some of them, this was their very first attempt at drawing or painting. It was a profoundly moving experience.
At my church last year, we held a church-wide book study based on the book Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. I was invited to collaborate on a reading guide that would offer meditations on the text. So for my part, I used pieces and stories from art history to draw connections between the themes of the book and various artistic expressions. This was one way that we were able to explore a complex text by amplifying it through visual and historical connections. Additionally, I was also invited to design a small group along with one of my friends based on a series of videos from the work of the people called Creating Our Way Through. It offered a series of meditations on what it means to be creative and how that fits in with our faith life. And so in addition to discussions on the video, we also designed a series of art projects that we could collaborate on. And so everyone who was able to participate in the study would offer their own interpretation of these tasks. The study extended beyond the video series. And so we were able to further deepen our understanding of the relationship between faith and life and art, and how creativity can be a spiritual practice.
I think there are many different ways that art can come into our congregational life. So some of these examples, as you saw, sometimes it means that we're going to look at art and get some ideas, or we can amplify something we read in scripture or some theme that we're discussing. And beyond contemplating and being maybe inspired and guided by these images, we can also invite the congregation to make art. Not everybody will be considered a great artist. Not everybody is going to be inclined to do that. But I think it's a very exciting way to explore these other dimensions of our own experience. Who knows, you may discover some great artists. And I have found that in that class that I mentioned, that people that have never considered getting close to any of these materials were suddenly very much inspired by the discovery of working with lines and textures and color, and kind of trying to express something without using words. So now would like to invite you to take some time considering some questions. If we were in person, we would actually hear from each other and spend some time, discussing this answers and different perspectives. And I think it would be wonderful, but since we can't, we'll do the best we can. So I invite you at this point, if you want to, when you're watching this video, to pause it and take some time to consider the questions. So here are some of the questions we'd like to pose for your consideration. Number one, what does your worship space look like? Number two, how might aesthetics impact the worship experience?
Number three, what art do you have displayed at your church? Number four, what does that art say about your congregation and community?
Number five, how might you incorporate visual arts in practice?
Number six, are you utilizing all the talents in your congregation? And number seven, would incorporating visual arts into your worship practice open up new spaces for service, offering new opportunities for participation to the members of your congregation?
Like scripture, art invites us to see. Consider the following passages. See how the flowers of the field grow. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Our theologian Angela Hummel shared the following thought recently. Words can say so much about who God is or what God isn't. It can only say so much. Thankfully, our thinking isn't limited to words. Using the creative languages of the arts, we can form new ideas, questions, and perceptions about God. We agree. Thank you.
Thank you.